Bienvenidos. Hoy está conmigo Alan Stoga, chairman de la Tällberg Foundation, para hablar de elecciones en Estados Unidos y su impacto en nuestro país. Alan, thank you so much for being here with us. And I would like to begin with, why should Mexico be paying attention in particular to this upcoming election in less than a month?
Years ago, I gave a speech in the United States in which I said the single most important foreign policy issue for America must, by definition, be Mexico because of the border. Same is true of Mexico. There's nothing more important to Mexico than what happens in the United States in terms of the rest of the world.
Why has this changed?
There are many pieces to answer that question. First, and it's terribly important, is that the Republican Party that we knew and the Democratic Party we knew a while ago have flipped. The Democrats are now the party of the establishment, of the bosses, of the college, university presidents and faculty and students, and the Republicans are now the Workers' Party. And in fact, if you look at the single biggest indicator as to how somebody's going to vote is whether or not they have a college education. If they have a college education, they are more likely to vote Democrat. If they don't have one, they're more likely to vote Republican. And that is just counterintuitive, given the model we have in our minds of what these two parties are. Second point is, of course, Donald. I know no country that managed the Donald Trump phenomenon better than Mexico. So part of the problem of Donald Trump is you make a mistake if you listen to him. Trump always talks more than he acts. And you don't care what he says. Oh, yes, it's racist, it's misogynist, it's this, it's that. Who the hell cares? You care what he does, what the United States, under his leadership then and potentially now, does. So focus on actions, not on words. Thirdly, I think one of the bigger problems, and we'll perhaps talk in more detail, if the Democrats win this election, the question becomes what kind of foreign policy will they pursue? That means we want the rest of the world to conduct their domestic policies the way we want them to conduct it. So, perfect example, Mexico's going through some important constitutional changes, not the least of which is the judicial situation. You already know that the United States government under President Biden has made its views known that they don't like this reform. And I would guarantee you that if Kamala Harris is president, they will make their views known aggressively.
Mexico has benefited from the tensions in between China and the U.S. at the beginning. Is this a relationship where Mexico cannot be friends with China if we want to be friends with the U.S. or if we want to have commerce? And in the revision of the USMCA, is this going to be, I mean, I know it's going to be a really tough issue, but is it going to come down to, are you my friend or are you theirs?
Countries don't have friends, they have interests. So I just don't, and they have allies. And they have geographic realities. And those are the three things that ought to determine foreign policy, including commercial and economic policy. National security is national security. So presumably one imagines, and the Chinese are doing the same thing on the other side. So we're in the process of witnessing in real time the pulling apart of globalization. It's still global, but it isn't what we thought it would be. We haven't gotten rid of all the barriers that we thought we'd get rid of. We don't have free movement of people, whether it's Huawei, whether it's other enterprises, whether it's TikTok, which is still an issue in the United States at the moment, that we feel are conduits to undermine our national security. There's a reason for us saying, got to stop. It's about whether or not we have an assessment of our national interest, and the Chinese the same, whether they then decide and we decide that there's certain things we will not tolerate. I suspect, and it's true of both Trump and Harris, at least based on the rhetoric, that if there's an agreement on foreign policy among the elites at the moment in the States, it's that we need to move towards a confrontation with China faster than we're moving, actually. And I think you are exactly right with the potential renewal of USMCA coming. There's no doubt in my mind that those two things are going to come together.
I want to zoom out a little bit, because the geopolitical complexity in which we live in is just making everything else harder to deal with. What does Mexico stand for today in a world with all these conflicts around, in the eyes of the United States?
There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the word Mexico has not and will not be mentioned in the current campaigns. And that's good news, because the last thing you want is the Americans using Mexico or some caricature of Mexico as a football in a game that you're not invited to play. The bad news is that geography rules. And as I said before, we, the Americans, you, the Mexicans, have to get the relationship right in a way that optimizes, maybe maximizes, peace and prosperity. And that we ought to start from there and work backwards to, okay, what are the issues and how do we manage those? How do we distill? Because we're all trying to get peace and prosperity for our people. There's good news. And the good news is, in fact, that this hemisphere is, the Americas, is more at peace than it's been in a long time. It's more prosperous in some ways than it's been in a long time. We want more prosperity. I would fault my country. We haven't had a coherent, consistent strategy vis-a-vis Mexico in particular, Latin America, Americas in general, other than NAFTA back in the day. The breakthrough, NAFTA was brilliant and really transformed how at least North America works. We don't have a project. We don't have a bilateral project. We don't have a regional project. And so we're doing okay. So we have to focus on what can we do, as I said, to maximize the peace and prosperity of our people.
You just mentioned NAFTA again, and there's a revision coming up in 2026. If we want to find that or get that prosperity that you just mentioned, what should we be paying attention to?
This goes back to a question you asked before in terms of the election in Mexico and the U.S. And I assume that at least one of the three countries will, in fact, demand to open USMCA, although theoretically they don't have to. It's possible. I assume, secondly, that if Trump is president, he will insist on it. If Kamala Harris is president, I think there's at least a chance she won't, but I don't think a very good chance. And thirdly, if I were Mexico, I would be thinking for either scenario long and hard about not how to play defense, but how to play offense. And by that I mean the migration issues are going to be there, whether they're in the room or outside the room, under the table, they're going to be there. I don't think you'll succeed in keeping it out of the room, although it informally wouldn't be in the USMCA, but it's like the air conditioning. It's going to determine the temperature of the room, and so that's got to be discussed.
How does migration affect the election? Because both of the parties have been really tough on this, and know that this is one of the things that need to be sort of taken care of.
Today, the foreign-born population in the United States is 14.3%. In the start of the 20th century, it peaked at 14.8% and fell over the course of the century, and then at the end of the century starts going back up. So this is the second highest. It's actually the highest in 100 years. And it's the second highest since the late 19th century. What happened the last time immigrants were this large a share of the population? What happened was there were race riots in Boston. There was wild discrimination against Chinese in California. There were problems with the Germans and the Poles and the Catholics. So one of the things we know, but for some reason nobody looking at today accepts, is that America, for better or for worse, I'm not arguing it's good, but it's a fact, accepts a lot of people and then goes through a really nasty process of digesting them. That's exactly what we did in the first half of the 20th century. We're now back to, and it's still climbing, so we'll get above the 14.3, so we'll get pretty close to that historic peak. Absolutely guaranteed that same thing is happening, that there's a reaction partially because you're making room for them in jobs, you're making room for them in schools, you're making room for them in budgets. So inevitably, And every country does this, by the way. Our swings are just more dramatic, like everything else in the United States. So the first point is that I don't understand why anybody is surprised, because we've seen this movie, and we know how it starts, and we know how it ends. Now, I'm not saying Americans aren't racist. We've always been racist. Going to be racist. Not saying we're not bigamous, but all that's true. But I'm saying that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the integration process of, and this important other fact, this huge migration is mostly Latin American, Mexican plus, but it's mostly Latin American. And it's going to come out just fine. It'd come out better if the sociologists would get out of the way, and if the government would stop saying, oh my God, how many hyphens do you want? I think that's a real problem. And it is, and I'm sure if some of my friends back in the States actually see this, they will be horrified that I just said that. But I had the same experience in Sweden. The Tällberg Foundation that I run is Swedish-based originally. Mm-hmm. Swedes were the best integrators of the diaspora coming out of Vietnam during the wars. Now the integration is just falling apart because the people coming in don't want to become Swedes. So I think people still want to become Americans. That's why they're going to America. That's why we've got lines at the border. So in this election, one of the things I think is being missed in Mexico, but you are spot on. Both candidates have said that they're going to tighten up dramatically border flows. And in fact, if you look at the polling, both people are going to vote Democrat and both people are going to vote Republican. Say one's at about 80, one's at about 90% the Republicans. Border security is incredibly important. So any good politician is going to do what the people are telling him. The huge difference is that, as you know, Trump is saying we are going to push illegals out of the country. How many? If you're Marco Rubio, there's 30 million. If everybody else's number is 11 to 12 million. Could we do that? I doubt it. Could he try? I'm sure he would try. That will be catastrophic. It'll be catastrophic for us and be catastrophic for Mexico. That's a huge risk. Now, I'm hoping to go full circle that it's in the category of something I said earlier. Watch what he does, not what he says, because it's a crazy idea. It's on every, never mind the human rights grounds, it's on every other ground. It's also a crazy idea. So I'm hoping that that's one of those that he forgets about, because like many old people, his memory isn't so great. So maybe this one will disappear.
Forget. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for this chat.